Welcome to Business Talk, a global podcast series where we bring you closer to some of the world's most distinguished scholars and their impactful ideas. I'm Deepak, your host from India. Imagine stepping into a new organization, new people, new culture, and new expectations. What determines whether someone thrives in their transition or struggles to find their footing? It is questions like this that sit at the heart of Dr. Scott Bentley's research. We are honored to welcome Dr. Scott Bentley to Business Talk today. An assistant professor of human resource management at the School of Management and Labor Relations at Rutgers University. Dr. Bentley has dedicated his academic journey to understanding how organizations create and sometimes compromise their competitive advantage through people. Having earned his PhD from Rutgers University in 2017, his work brings together the fields of strategic human resource management and strategic human capital to uncover how investments in employees shape organizational success. At core of his research lies a powerful idea that people are not just resources, but strategic drivers of value. His work explores how firms invest in employees and HR systems, how so-called star employees influence performance and dynamics, and how human capital fits into the broader organizational ecosystem. Through these interconnected themes, Dr. Bentley reveals both the promise and the pitfalls of workforce decisions. His contributions have appeared in some of the most respected journals in the field, including the Academy of Management Journal, Journal of Applied Psychology, Journal of Management and Personal Psychology. Beyond his research, he plays an active role in shaping the academic community, serving on the executive committee of the Human Resources Division at the Academy of Management and contributing as an editorial board member for several leading journals. Today, we turn to one of his most compelling research works, co-authored and titled Moving and Groovin. Increased prior mobility facilitates newcomers' transitions into organizations, where he explores how past experiences shape how individuals adapt to new professional environments. So, without further delay, let's welcome and bring him into the conversation. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Scott Bentley. Professor Scott, thank you for accepting our invitation and joining us on this episode. I am equally grateful to Dr. Rebecca Cohe for recommending you for our channel. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Deepak. Excited to be here.
Thank you. Professor, your study introduces the idea of a mobility benefit for job hoppers. Could you walk us through how repeated moves across organizations actually build this benefit for newcomers entering a fresh workplace?
Sure. And what's exciting about this research is that this notion of a mobility benefit, it's something that anyone who's changed jobs may have experienced to some extent. And in preparing some answers to some of the questions I thought you might be asking, I took a look at your resume as well and noticed that you've also experienced job moves holding the same title. And so some of these ideas might resonate with you as you changed employers holding the job of CHRO. As we change jobs, we enter this new context. And when we do so, we're inundated with a bunch of new experiences, whether it's walking into a new office building, sitting into our new office for the first time, or meeting our new colleagues. Just a simple walk to grab some water comes with this kind of what many of us might see as this exhausting experience where we're having to navigate this new space, we're having to meet new people, we're engaging in small talk. And this is burdensome for our cognitive selves and our brains because this process of becoming integrated into a new workplace and the new social ecosystem is challenging and it's full of uncertainty. We don't know these people, we don't know the physical space. And what we know from cognitive psychology is that our brains don't like this. It doesn't like uncertainty. It doesn't like having problems. It doesn't like having challenges. And so our brains seek out to avoid those situations that evoke those strong negative emotions because it's uncomfortable. It requires more effort. It requires more energy. And because of that, the reality is that coming into a new organization is fraught with these experiences. And it's extremely uncomfortable. And again, it could take more energy. But because it's fraught with that, this is where job hoppers can actually shine, right? Because for many of them, they've actually already experienced this. They've changed employers and they've gone through this integration process multiple times. And so while their brains are still working just like everyone else's who maybe have not changed jobs at all or as frequently, they're still having to navigate meeting new colleagues. They're still having to navigate, how do I find the bathroom? How do I find where we have our seltzer in a refrigerator? Where is the refrigerator? How do I navigate small talk? But what they do very well is that they adapt well. And the reason they adapt well is that when our brains are encountering these situations that are challenging and are characterized as unpredictable and faced with uncertainties, we look out for patterns. Because when we can observe patterns, that reduces uncertainty. It reduces how unfamiliar things seem. And so when you've changed employers multiple times, you start to see similarities across the employers between the old and the new. And you start to see similarities in how you integrated in prior experiences into this new one. And it gives you an idea about how to learn, how to learn to adapt. And so that's where job hoppers have this really advanced competence, is that they can look at those prior experiences, draw on them, and learn so that they can integrate and adapt more effectively. And so in essence, they're better at learning how to learn. But an important thing is that they also are able to unlearn. And so they can see what didn't work in a past experience or what's dissimilar between the old and the new environment and understand how to not be as attached to some of those prior skills or prior strategies that they employed when integrating into that kind of older social system within a prior employer. And so they're better at learning how to learn, but they're also better at unlearning certain things that didn't work as well in the past.
Professor, the paper find that more mobile individuals suffer a smaller performance decline and recover faster when they join a new employer. How did you capture and measure this performance shift in the hedge fund context?
Yeah, so really great question because it narrows down that what we were interested in was performance. And in a general sense, we were interested in how performance changes as someone's entering this new employer. And so there's different ways we could think about performance. And we think about it in this first way, which is trajectory over time. We could think about how someone's performance is changing over a given time period. And we specifically think about it in terms of this disruption that occurs when someone's changing employers, what we call these mobility events. The other way to think about it is is performance in terms of discrete tasks, like completing a financial report or submitting a performance review. That's not what we're thinking about here. We're looking at performance not in this discontinuous way, but rather in this continuous way, which is really helpful because we can see how the mobility event is going to kind of provide a shock to the system. Similar to, we can think about athletic performance for an athlete over the course of a season, right? It's kind of continuous over time. And so back to the question of how did we specifically focus about it here, we again look at it within the context of the hedge fund industry. And so for any listeners kind of unfamiliar with this industry or what hedge funds do, they're organizations privately held that manage and invest money for investors. They tend to be high net worth or what are called accredited, educated investors. And they tend to be teams oriented, and they aim to employ a strategy that allows for them to provide returns on this investment, a return on capital, that are protected against the general volatility and downside risks that characterize the market. So in essence, they kind of operate like mutual funds, but in a private way for private investors. And so whether it's a mutual fund or a financial advisor who's investing capital or a hedge fund advisor, they're really focusing at the core of their job on returns and returns on investments. And so what we think about is this return on investment over time, obviously, because it's continuous, but we think about two aspects of it. First, that disruption. So it's the shock to the system. They change jobs. And what we know from prior research is that when we have these mobility events, when we change jobs or enter into a new employer, our performance immediately drops in that initial period. So the first question we asked was, okay, how much is it dropping? The second was, okay, so it's dropped, but how long does it take for it to recover? We know from prior research that following this kind of first stage of disruption is a recovery stage. So we were really interested as well in how are they recovering? Specifically, how did we get at this and operationalize it within the hedge fund context? Because one of the things, was personally interesting to me was the hedge fund context was how many measures of performance they actually focus on. I think early on, I was shocked when we were collecting the data to see that there was over 50 measures of performance. And so we really dug into the econ and finance literature to understand what are the primary measures that they use And so there were a couple. We focused on the Sortino ratio, which is a measure of investment returns that adjusts for what's called the risk-free rate and investment risk. And so it adjusts for the two most common things that investors are really focusing on, which how much risk are we taking, and what else could I be doing with this money to generate a return, which is referred to as the risk-free rate.
Professor, the paper integrates newcomer socialization with the generalization of learning. In practical terms, what kind of lessons or experiences from prior jobs become transferable when entering a new organizational culture?
Yeah, so I'm glad you've highlighted this notion of transferability in your question. Since some of the learning that's going to occur in the workplace it can be specific to that context, and we're not really pushing back about, is it all going to be generalizable? It can be less applicable elsewhere. But across workplaces, there seem to be a few generalizable aspects where lessons and experiences can be understood to transcend any one kind of particular instance in time. Um, and so really three come to mind here. The first is social interactions. So understanding kind of the nature of formality surrounding these interactions, how informal or formal, what is the mode of communication that's accepted to be used at different points? So when is it okay to text about certain things versus send an email? How do you address your colleagues? What are the norms surrounding tone of your communications, both in person and digital? And what kind of conversations or ideas can be expressed kind of behind closed doors? This is what happens in a meeting versus this is more of a public discussion. And let's kind of have some discourse over how to handle the situation. The second and related is how is the work organized and completed? So understanding the formal versus informal collaboration. So when is it going to be a good idea to understand when to kind of form a committee and have it more formalized and instituted that we are formally working together on this versus I'm just asking for some insights on this and can you kind of help me out and be a good colleague in coaching me on how to kind of complete this task or to perform my job in this way. And relate that to this norm surrounding extra role behaviors. So things that are outside your job description. So just helping your colleagues, being that good colleague, being that friendly person in the workplace that it's beyond the scope of your job, but you really want to help them succeed. And so understanding how you can play that role is something that newcomer socialization is really going to play a key role in understanding how that can generalize across different experiences within a workplace, but also between workplaces when you're switching jobs, switching employers. And then the last one is social acceptance and tolerance for norm adherence, but also violation. This is something that I think is really interesting. We think a lot within research about how you can act a certain way, behave, or say things that kind of go along with and adhere to the norms and the standards and the expectations within the workplace. But what about when we violate that? What if we say something that deviates from what is accepted? And so this newcomer socialization, this idea of generalization of learning is really about understanding kind of how to appropriately respond and adapt, but also that unlearning that I referenced earlier about making sure you don't have those missteps and learning from prior mistakes.
Professor, one of your key arguments in that prior mobility helps people adapt to norms, values, and expectations in new social context. What did you discover about the specific social skills or adaptation strategies that frequently movers tend to develop?
Yeah, so in essence, it really kind of boils down to this notion that job hoppers are going to possess enhanced capabilities for, again, that learning how to learn and unlearning what they should not be adopting. And so what they do learn here they learn three really important things. The first is they learn how to detect and interpret cues in their social context. So again, when we're entering that new workplace, we're inundated with stimuli. It's like a new place, new experiences, new senses, new people, new conversations. You're trying to remember and codify all of this information. And they are very strong at being able to sift and organize and say, this is important kind of confine this to memory, right? This is probably tangential. This is something that maybe we could kind of reanalyze later, but how to detect and interpret those cues and understand what's important and not important, they're really, really good at. They're also really good at developing a competence in identifying and enacting those appropriate behaviors, which again are going to um, align with the norms and the values of that particular organization. And then lastly, they're good at adapting. So there's the interpreting the cues, there's identifying and enacting, but then there's that adjustment period, right? So there's the interpretation, bringing the information in, there's the organizing of the information, and then there's the implementation, the so what of all this information that you've even organized. And so they're really good about those three aspects. And so what they're doing well there within their ability to adapt is anticipating those unwritten rules and social norms. And so there's those just kind of those tangible, kind of explicit norms of like, okay, this is how things are done in the workplace. I can see the names on these doors. I know how things are going to be organized. But what are those unspoken things? What are those unwritten rules? And that's where job hoppers are really going to shine in these kind of scenarios. Um, and while we weren't really able to observe this in our research and test for it, I think one thing, if I could kind of expand on our research a little bit and make some inferences, is that the job hoppers are really skilled in their ability not to violate those social norms. I think adhering to them shows signs of development and kind of acceptance within the social system. And it can take time to develop that, right? But it can easily falter if you violate them in some situations. And so I think one thing that I would love to be able to research in the future and expand on is understanding how job hoppers navigate those kind of potholes, those sinkholes in the workplace of those missteps people can take that are really hard to kind of come back from.
Your findings show that the mobility benefit is especially strong when social integration is more challenging or central to the role. Can you describe what a challenging social integration setting look like and why mobility matters more there?
Yeah, and so as I mentioned, anyone that's changed jobs, this may kind of resonate with them. I think for me personally, as like a kind of secret introvert, we all have to be extroverts within the profession. We're doing an interview, so I have to be extroverted, but it takes emotional labor, right? You and I had never met before, and so that's a challenging social process that we're going through, a sense-making process. And so I think it's fair to say that all integration experiences people have coming into organizations or social interactions can be challenging. It's about this kind of continuum of to what extent are they going to be challenging. Um, and overall, I think the challenge in the social integration lies in two aspects, right? There's the uncertainty part. You have no idea what you're entering into until you enter into it. And then there's the uniqueness part. That part I kind of alluded to in the beginning of the interview, that our brain does not like. It does not like the uncertainty. It does not like having something that's very dissimilar, something different, something that's going to challenge us to think. Our brains are not wired that way. They want to avoid those situations. We want to find patterns. And so the challenging social integration comes down to challenging landscapes that they're going to have to navigate and understanding the established ways of doing things, the established ways of working, those written and unwritten rules for how things are done. And when those landscapes are more stark, those differences, a newcomer is likely to face a more challenging process of social integration, right? Kind of going into a meeting with people you already know that you've had meetings with before is much easier than going into a meeting that you've had before, but with new people. And that's even easier than a meeting with people you've never met and you've never had this kind of meeting before. And so we see these different gradations of levels of difficulty. And so when you're interacting with colleagues with more stringent and established norms, where they're not likely to be as kind of flexible and understanding when you violate those norms, it's going to be much more difficult to integrate. It's going to be much more challenging. When collaboration is required, so you're not just trying to learn the unwritten rules and written rules of how work is done in the organization and some of those norms, but it's a core requirement of your job. You have to collaborate with these people to be successful. It's a strong portion of your job that again is going to be extremely more challenging for individuals. And when you see those differences again as being greater between the old employer and the new, it's going to provide an even bigger hurdle and be more challenging for social integration.
Professor, you used data from 8,693 hedge fund managers across 2,129 firms over 15 years to test your theory. Why was the hedge fund industry an ideal setting for this research? And what did that Sortino ratio allow you to see that other metrics might miss?
So I will have to make a confession here. In all of my research, I have a particular interest in every single one of the industries that I study, that I use data from. Um, I have a background and a strong interest in the financial services industry. So several times I've used data on banks because I just have a personal odd interest in banking. I think it's really interesting and fascinating to study. And so when given an opportunity, why not study that? Um, and with hedge funds, it's a context that we see collaboration. We know human capital matters, right? We know this knowledge, skills, and abilities. So it maps on with my research interests there. But it's one we haven't studied a lot in within management and business. We have a lot in terms of finance about hedge funds and efficiency and their ability to generate returns that exceed the market, right? How much better are they than a market investment? But we don't know as about the human capital within hedge funds. We don't know as much about stars, which is another thing I study within hedge funds, is star hedge fund managers. And so, I mean, I'm smiling now. I get really excited being able to talk about hedge funds because we don't get to talk about them a lot because they are private. They're somewhat mysterious. We talk about the managers, but we don't know about the inner workings. And so we were able to collect data on the vast majority of hedge funds over a 20-year period of time, monthly level data across all these hedge fund managers. And so to me, it was a very exciting and interesting context to study this in. Um, and what made it particularly relevant and well suited for this research is we also have standardized job titles. And so over this 20-year period, hedge funds have changed somewhat. Regulation has changed, their strategies have changed, but at the end of the day, they're investing large pools of money for investors. That hasn't changed. The primary job within a hedge fund is hedge fund manager, so the people making decisions and executing the trades. That hasn't changed. The title hasn't changed. The responsibilities haven't changed. And so we have a fixed job responsibility where we have managers deciding the same things now that they decided 20 years ago. How they make those decisions can change, but the decisions they're focusing on have not really changed all that much. Also, this is a context where changing employers is actually pretty common. A couple of months ago, I was listening to an interview on CNBC about the war for talent within hedge funds and that it's heating up again and that people are changing employers constantly. It's a revolving door for a lot of them. And so selfishly, it made me very excited to study it in this context because it's something that we see is really tangible and something that's really going on within that industry. Um, in terms of the Sortino ratio, what it allowed for us to see that other metrics could miss, it really came down to using a measure that captured investment returns, but also accounted for the two big factors that, regardless of the type of investor, the time frame they were using of short term versus long term, they were all going to be, it's safe to assume they're all going to be focusing on what else could I be doing with this money to generate a return? And how does it compare when we take into account the investment risk? How risky is this strategy? Um, and so while we did look at the econ and finance literatures to make sure that this measure was valid and reliable, given their focus on hedge fund returns, how are they measuring it? We also measured it using alternative measures of hedge fund performance, just to make sure our results were robust.
Professor, the study speaks to broader debates about firm-specific human capital and career mobility. How do your results complicate the traditional view that deeper firm-specific skills always constrain employees' ability to move or succeed elsewhere?
Yeah, so this is a really good question, one that it requires a little bit of thought. I think it's fair to look at our results and research and think about how it can complicate that traditional view, right? Especially in the early stages of the human capital research, we kind of bucketed human capital. And that, so again, human capital being our knowledge, skills, abilities, and other attributes that relate to performance as being kind of industry specific. And so it generalizes across firms, but it's really specific to an industry skill set. Then we had firm specific. Then we have generalizable, like general education can be generalizable. And so I think, maybe 5 or 6 years ago, that's exactly how I would have viewed it. That what our findings are showing or suggesting is really complicating that traditional view. Um, And maybe it's the aging, maybe it's the gray hair I'm now starting to develop. But I tend to think about the research a little bit differently now. And I think about it not in terms of how is it complicating things, but how is it contributing to that growing conversation and discourse on research surrounding employee mobility, rather than how is it going to complicate it? How is it going to throw a wrench in the gears of this view? And so I think it's important to remember that the human capital that the employees possess and develop as they advance in their careers, remember, we're thinking about people as they advance kind of over their careers, it can definitely be firm specific. It can definitely be kind of entrenched within how it applies within one organization. And when you take someone out of that organization, the skills are less applicable, if applicable at all. But some of that human capital can be transferable. It's not necessarily this zero-sum game of if you invest in developing certain skills within a company, you can either take them with you completely or you have to leave them there. And so I think this is where job hoppers possibly are really skilled as well, is understanding because they've gone through this period of experiencing the transferability process, what transfers, what doesn't. And so to some extent, it could push back a little bit by saying maybe they are better suited at understanding when to make some of those investments and understand that they're a sunk cost, that it helps you perform better in this organization, but it's not going to be helpful as you integrate into another organization. So maybe they can navigate those waters a little bit better. But I like to think that maybe it's that they're better at understanding how can I invest in developing those to contribute and add value to my current employer. But should I leave in the future, this is something that could provide me with a benefit and transfer, maybe if not to the full extent, somewhat, because it helps enrich maybe some of their other skills. Um, and recently I transferred or I changed and joined the faculty here at Rutgers from University of Delaware. And there at University of Delaware, I was within a business school. Here at Rutgers, I'm not within a business school. I'm within a school of management. And so there we were very focused on their MBA program, and that was a shock to me. I taught almost exclusively MBA students. It was a huge learning curve for me. I'd never done that before. And to develop new skills and knowledge for delivering the same exact strategy, strategic management course to MBA students who were focusing on mergers and acquisitions. They were focusing on competitive advantage so intently and financial metrics. And so transferring that course over to Rutgers for students who were masters in HR, I had to take some of that same skills and knowledge. And so it wasn't as applicable of, okay, well, here's how I taught MBAs at another university. It was, okay, I learned a skill on how to adapt and how to change things and think differently and show students that there's different perspectives. And so, yes, some of that was not transferable completely to Rutgers, but my ability to understand alternative perspectives and then be able to kind of communicate that effectively to someone who takes a different perspective and get them on board with understanding that alternative perspective was. And so I think that's an example of personal experience of mine that shows like, yeah, there could be some kind of sunk cost to learning some skills or adopting them within a given firm. But if you've changed jobs before you change employers, you can start to see how you can transfer some of that when integrating into a new organization.
Professing in highly collaborative roles, your research suggests that newcomers with more prior mobility experience less of a performance drop, yet don't necessarily recover faster. How do you interpret this pattern? And what might it mean for team-based work?
Yeah, so not all of our hypotheses were supported. And the paper is a nice way of putting that, right? So we did find that there was this performance drops in these highly collaborative roles. And for those who are familiar with the hedge fund context, how we thought about highly collaborative roles was sometimes these funds have what's called a co-man clause. So they're co-managed. And the co-man clause means that there's someone designated in that investment fund who has to sign off on all of the strategic and what are considered very important decisions. So how to change the strategy or how to unload on a specific position that they have in investments. And so when you invest in a hedge fund, you might be investing for that particular person. But with the co-managed fund, is really highlighting there is that you have to collaborate. It's a highly collaborative context, and it's core to your role that you're going to be collaborating. And so while we found that the newcomers with more prior experience, mobility experience, so the job hoppers did experience less of a performance drop, their recovery was about the same. And that was kind of surprising to us. Um, And so, how do we interpret this pattern? Well, one potential explanation, I think, is that this team-based setting, that's the one thing that's very unique here about this set of hypotheses or this kind of challenging social context that they're integrating is there's collaboration, which means there's teamwork. So you're having to explicitly work with those peers. And so while they don't get up to speed as quickly as they enter an organization, I think a lot of it is because um, they're being helped by the newcomers, the non-job hoppers. And so teammates are actually probably playing a bigger role here in helping all newcomers, regardless of how much you've had mobility experience in the past, how many jobs you've changed. And so since they don't have a lot of an opportunity to work with them in that first initial period, we see job hoppers actually have that advantage in the first month of changing employers so that their performance is not going to drop. But after that initial drop, you can have some help and collaborate with your peers where they can help improve your performance. And so it's not about job hoppers are performing worse or they're not performing any better. It's that you're bringing up the people who need that help more so that they can recover at the same level as job hoppers. And so I think it really comes down to that collaborative environment, which is more challenging to enter into, but it also provides you with a resource. Those collaborators can help you and help those who need it most. And I think that's possibly one explanation of what we're seeing here, which is also an encouraging silver lining to this one.
Professor, for hiring managers and HR leaders, what practical guidance emerges from your findings? In which types of roles or organizational environments should they actively favor candidates with more mobile career histories?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important question here about when to favor candidates with more mobile career histories because we can look at articles in kind of Forbes, Fortune, HBR, where they've rightly characterized job hoppers or people who have changed career or who have changed employers more often as kind of possessing this red flag characteristic that they might be a flight risk. They're going to be less committed to the organization because they've changed jobs repeatedly, right? But what our research is actually suggesting here is that they actually might provide a benefit that those who don't have that kind of red flag on their resume aren't going to necessarily be able to provide. So, because what we see is that they have less of a performance drop and they're quicker at recovering from those performance drops, situations where you need someone who can get up to speed quickly, where they're able to contribute to the team's collective performance is going to be more paramount. That's where job hoppers are actually going to have this advantage where you might want to favor candidates with a more mobile career history. And, you know, I think in thinking through certain like kind of industries or certain jobs, like where are we likely to see this? This is something my colleague and I recently started kind of thinking through. Is like outside of hedge funds, right? Outside of managing hundreds of millions of dollars, like who else is going to need to kind of have a focus on this, right? Because luckily for you and I, we don't operate within those kind of contexts where there's zero tolerance for performance drop or zero tolerance for not recovering as quickly. We could think about military personnel. They can change assignments, they can change roles. We can think about medical professionals such as surgeons or anesthesiologists, where you don't want a learning curve. When they're changing hospitals, you don't want to say, okay, we do things differently here, but you'll get your head wrapped around it. Like, get your feet wet, learn through errors, learn through mistakes. Like, you kind of want them up to speed very, very, very quickly. Um, and so when there's a lot of pressure for performance, when there's a lot of consequences, and it's a high stakes environment where having negative performance shocks are detrimental significantly to customers, whether it's in a hospital or for the military, that's where I think job hoppers can actually provide an even stronger benefit because of the nature of employment that they're operating within, and also the expectations of their ability to transfer between employers. And so I think those are two kind of contexts where we're likely to see this strongest and where, from a practical sense, job hoppers can offer increased value.
Professor Scott, I would like to conclude this episode with one last question. Stepping back, what do you think your work tells us about modern careers, especially in an era where job hopping is increasingly common? And how should both organizations and individuals rethink the balance between stability and mobility?
So I love that you added that last part there, that balance part, right? The balance between stability and mobility, right? Um, and it wasn't until this paper was published that I stopped spending so much time and so much of my life really thinking about the review process and reviewer comments. And, as you mentioned, a hypothesis not being supported, like how could we explain this? Like what could be going on here, right? And then I finally had a chance to think about what does this all mean? And what does it mean going forward? This process, it's been years in the making of this paper and this research. And so it actually caused me to think kind of and reflect on the early stages of my journey with this. Like as an undergraduate, I decided to major in economics and minor in labor studies. And I thought the labor studies courses gave me this focus on labor market history that would provide me with really helpful insights about how the labor market and the US worker, but also kind of workers in Japan and India, um, how it evolved over time, how the nature of work changed over time. And it gave me a strong appreciation for that. And so one of the things I've really come to realize is that no one knows the future, right? But what we know is that whether it be in Japan, the US, or in India, since the 1980s, really, been this systematic and systemic shift away from lifelong employment. I mean, that was something that was quintessential, especially within India and Japan, was you started and ended your career within one employer. And in the 80s, we started seeing, okay, maybe that's not necessarily the case. And this trend of changing employers became more commonplace. It was not uncommon to change employers, but it wasn't common. Now it's extremely uncommon to start and end your career at one employer. And this trend exploded, I say, during COVID, where we saw people job hopping, and that level went up to kind of historic highs of number of times people were changing jobs over a short period of time, right? But having been a student of labor market history within the US and elsewhere, I see that a lot of times it's a pendulum and it swings in two directions. And so now, whether it be because of increased layoffs or the adoption of AI within the workplace, the greater adoption of AI in the workplace, we're seeing this switch away from job hopping to job hugging. And people are looking to hold on to their jobs a little bit more. And so who knows when that pendulum could swing kind of back in the other direction. Um, but I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's also important to acknowledge that traditionally, again, job hopping has been viewed as this red flag in the screening process. And so several business and HR outlets have really published articles about that red flag and why you should be worried and why this could be something to avoid. And our research is really saying, you know, the job hopping is occurring. You're going to see this on resumes. As hiring managers are reviewing applicants, it's not about whether or not this represents someone you should avoid. This is the majority of people you're evaluating have changed jobs. And so what are the benefits they can bring to the organization? Those risks that I mentioned still hold. They could still be less engaged. They could still be kind of less committed to the organization or more resistant to change, kind of that quintessential, but this is how we did it in our last company, or this is how I did it in my last job. Um, but there's a huge benefit. And so I think as we move into evaluating kind of the modern employee and the modern applicant, it's about understanding kind of the current context in which their career is being shaped. Some people that are starting their career during the COVID period are more likely to have changed jobs a lot early in their career for a variety of reasons. And so kind of relaxing that assumption that it necessarily has this inherent red flag or this avoid aspect to those applicants, I think is something that I would like for our research to kind of soften and speak to that it's understanding the potential benefits and opportunities that they can provide your organization as they successfully integrate into the context.
Listeners, thank you for joining us for this insightful conversation on career mobility and newcomer transitions. Professor Scott Bentley's work offers a fresh lens on how our past moves shape our future success at work, and we hope it sparks new thinking in your own career and organizational practices. On behalf of Business Talk, this is Deepak Bhatt signing off. Until next time, stay curious and keep this conversation on business and research moving forward. Thank you once again, Dr. Scott Bentley, for joining us on Business Talk.
Thank you so much.